Thank you. All right, well, we have Bill joining us online and Betty in person. Hey, nice to see you. We were wondering if you're real. Yeah, good to have you here. Let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll read the text. Gracious God, give us minds that are open to wonder, hearts that are open to seeing the broad spectrum of human ambition. Give us lives that are open to the difficult call to discipleship and the joyous call to be your children. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so let's read the story, starting with verse 35 of Mark chapter 10. And I hope everyone got a handout. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." All right, there we go. Let me start by just asking you, what are some of the concerns or questions you want to make sure that we address today while we're here? Jerome, can I ask you a favor? I need a handout. Could you grab one? Thank you. All right, any questions you have? Yes.
Well, it's not really a question. It's just that I am constantly, as I read this, reminded that these Jewish men are at odds with what their perception of what they thought the Messiah was going to be.
Yeah.
And they're just baffled either by Jesus' words or his behavior, because it's just not the perception. I equate it to like waiting for Santa Claus and the great pumpkin shows up. You know, it's just,
Or doesn't.
or doesn't.
Yeah.
You know, it just and so much of what is being said, if I take it back that they are Jewish men and that's what they are, they do not understand the resurrection at all. It's not in their realm, I don't think, until they experience it. So everything they say, sitting on the right hand and the left hand, that's such a military, question to me.
Right. Yeah, it does raise the question of what they have in mind. I think the use of the word Gentile twice in the larger text, if you include verses 32 through 34, indicates what they have in mind, which is the Roman Empire. Yeah, and why not? It's a terribly effective way to run the world. There's a great scene from Life of Brian where this Jewish group, this is the Monty Python, this Jewish group is arguing that they need to overcome the empire, and one of them said, "What has Rome ever done for us?" And trying to get the others angry, and someone said, "Aquifers." They built the aqueduct, you know, okay, they built the aqueduct, but besides that, what have they, and the Pax Romana said, okay, so we've had Roman peace, but besides those two things, and they keep naming all of the benefits that they get from the Roman Empire, and finally he names about some, but in addition to that, what has the empire ever done for us? And they're like, nothing. It was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag. It was, I'd say it was a better imperial structure than some of the others they had suffered through, but they didn't want necessarily to be living under an imperial structure. It was a lot about Rome's way of doing things that the folks in Judea appreciated, imitated. So I think one thing we really have to take seriously about this text is it shows us what's meant when we talk about people internalizing their oppression. Internalizing their oppression. You hear that phrase a lot, very popular these days. And it means on the one hand, you start to come to accept that, yeah, they're in charge, we're not. And you kind of lose your indignant edge over that, you know, and just becomes, you accept it as a way of life. That's part of internalizing. But even more of it is you start to internalize the values of your oppressor. And I think you see that really clearly in what James and John ask here. They presume that when Jesus comes in his glory, it will look like the Roman Empire. Because for them, that is now the image of effective imperial rule. And so when Jesus all along now has been talking about the reign of God at hand, they are presuming that it's going to look like the empire. And this is why the entry into Jerusalem, where Jesus comes in riding on a colt that's never been ridden, is such a significant piece of symbolism, because Jesus is trying to turn that upside down. But they're showing that by virtue of living under the empire for so long, they're really starting to absorb and reflect, presume the values of the empire. And that is a huge problem, not just for James and John, and not just for the disciples, but you know the history of the Christian church, right? It didn't take too many centuries before the Christian church, the followers of someone who was put to death at the hand of the empire, became aligned with the empire and had a Holy Roman Emperor, and structured itself almost exactly like the empire, with the Pope, the Curia, the archbishops, the bishops, the chain of command, as it were, was inherited from the empire. So we began, even the Christian church began to imitate the very structure that put Jesus to death. And I would say many Christians today still aspire for that kind of, that view of power. What it means when the reign of God comes in power, it means we win and we control things. That is the impetus behind Christian nationalism as well. Beryl, you had.
Well, would we then attribute their request to being something similar to what the structure might be, that the ruler has an important person on the right and an important person on the left? Maybe one is more important than the other. But that would be their request again would mimic what they are, what they know about power structure.
Right, that's what I think. Yeah. Now, I think there's also something else at play here, and this is Brilliant Mark writing. Brilliant Mark is writing, not me, the writer. Brilliant Mark is writing after the resurrection. Brilliant Mark knows what happened in the crucifixion. There was someone on Jesus' right and on his left when he was hanging on the cross. The same terms are used to describe where they are, on your right and on your left. Jesus speaks of his death as his glory on occasion. I think Mark is writing from a post-crucifixion, post-resurrection perspective, and is laying an extra layer of kind of interesting, I would suggest even, not playful, it's too serious for that. But he's writing to a post-crucifixion, post-resurrection community who know this also, that they are asked to be on his right and his left. They don't know what they're asking for. Jesus is right. That if they don't want to hang on his right and on his left, they don't want to be there. And that raises a question when Jesus says, it's not mine to decide, but those for whom it is appointed. It's hard to tell in translating that what the pronoun is referring to. Whether he's referring to whoever it is on his right and left, or whoever does the appointing. My suggestion is that's what he's referring to. It's not mine to decide who hangs on my right and my left, but those to whom it is given. And that would be the Roman soldiers. I think this is a foreshadowing of what we're getting ready to see in the crucifixion. And Jesus is right. James and John have no idea what they're asking. Because if they had listened, if they had listened all along, and Jesus will say it again very clearly in the 13th chapter, the Son of Man sits at the right hand of God. So Jesus even subordinates himself to being on the right side of God, as opposed to Jesus being on the, at the top and then having a right side. So I think Mark is being very creative in the way he's telling this story. I think James and John have the wrong structure in mind, and Mark also, the way he tells the story is chapter 8. We have a disclosure: Jesus is going to die. One or more of the disciples respond badly. Jesus teaches them and uses a paradox of the least and the greatest, the servant and the master. That kind of paradox happens in chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10. I tried to give you those texts so you could kind of get curious and see that right there in the middle of this gospel, this is during which Jesus leaves Galilee and goes to Judea, where he's going to die. 3 times he discloses his forthcoming death. 3 times somebody responds inappropriately. 3 times Jesus teaches and uses the paradox of the greater and the lesser. Whoever would be great among you must become a servant. That is the anti-empire, anti-imperial approach to being great. And James and John don't get it. And it's not just them. In the first time, it was Peter. And in the second time, it was all of them. They were all arguing over who among them was the greatest. So they still have internalized. Look, one of the hardest aspects of salvation, and I mean that just in the broadest sense you can imagine, one of the hardest aspects of salvation is to lose our internal oppression. I think that's why the story of the people of Israel, when they're released from slavery in Egypt, they spend 40 years in the desert. 40 years, during which they said it was so much better back in Egypt. Well, we had our pots were full and we ate and we had a place that you got us out here wandering the desert. We might drown. We might thirst to death, we might starve to death. And God gives them water out of a rock after they're complaining, right? God gives them manna from heaven, which they later describe as this miserable food. It's like a 40-year period of trying to weed out of their thinking their notion of themselves as slave, as something other than God's people. And then, you know, as they're getting toward the promised land, we now get to the book of Joshua. The thing is, when you get to the promised land, don't do what you saw happening back there. Be a different. This is the process of sanctification. It is weeding out old ways of thinking in order to adopt new ways of thinking. And I think the disciples struggling with that throughout Mark's gospel. I've said this a million times, going to say it again. Werner Kelber argues, and I don't think he's wrong. He argues that in Mark's view, the disciples failed. Jesus told them to meet him in Galilee, and they didn't do it. They stayed in Jerusalem. And they began the early church imitating the structure that the Jewish hierarchy had taken on, imitating the Roman Empire. Instead of going back to Galilee and having a village-based grassroots movement, as Jesus told them to do. Now, Matthew and Luke don't present it that way. John doesn't present it that way. But Mark has a beef with the disciples. They're not just slow on the uptake. They're resistant. They're resistant to the way that Jesus was trying to get them to think. And James and John represent. All right, Betty, you gave me a skeptical look. You don't necessarily think Mark has what?
I was wondering if, since the original version of Mark doesn't include the resurrection, how much of his writing is reflected in the post-resurrection?
Well, it includes the resurrection. It doesn't include the resurrected Christ. Yeah. So the original ending of Mark's gospel is in the 16th chapter on the 8th verse. We don't see Jesus in that chapter, but neither does anyone else, because the women go to the tomb to care for Jesus' dead body, and they're told by the angel, he's not here, he's risen. The resurrection happened. And then the angel says, go tell Peter and his disciples that he will meet you in Galilee, as he said. And the last verse says, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's the original ending. That's the ending in the oldest manuscript. Verses 9 through 21 have been added because it's the least happy ending you've ever seen in your life. And in my reckoning, Matthew and Luke also were unhappy with that as a final ending and have much more extended resurrection story. So it is a post-resurrection text. It does, I think Mark is writing from the perspective of both post-crucifixion and post-resurrection. But he's not a fan of the disciples. Isn't that odd? I was looking up the word right and left just to make sure they're the same terms that are used in the crucifixion story. And in fact, they are. But there's a curious thing. The King James Bible was based on the available text at the time. I mean, it's published in 1611, right? So the available text at the time, one of the chief texts they had, and I'm not a textual scholar, but called the Textus Receptus. So it's got a Latin title to it. And since that time, we have discovered other manuscripts that are considerably older. Which is why we read the New Revised Standard Version and other translations based on older texts than the King James. In the King James Bible, the word for left is different. The Greek word for left is different than it is in the older manuscripts. Well, let me say that more correctly. In the manuscripts that the King James Bible were using, the word for left is different than it is in the older manuscripts. There are two different Greek words for left. I don't know why it's changed. I can't figure it out. Except that it seems like the left hand kind of has a history that perhaps is more developed as time goes on. The Greek word for left, there's a Greek word for left that basically means good word, eunomos. And apparently it was used sarcastically because everyone knows the left is the bad part. We have a song in our hymnal called The Right Hand of God. That's the hand of justice. The left hand of God, Martin Luther once said, we have to be willing to receive both the blessings from the right hand of God and the challenges from the left hand of God. So there was this kind of sense that the left hand was kind of the pernicious one. And that's not so much reflected in the older manuscripts, the term that's used for left, but the one by the time the King James Greek manuscripts that they used were available. They've gone with a term that has more ominous meaning to it. In fact, it almost sounds like the word ominous. And it had become more prevalent in other Greek writings even though it technically means good name, good word, good name, eunomos. It was meant to represent something that was evil, right? Yeah, so it's kind of interesting that what that shows us is that the copyists who are copying these texts from text to text, they're trying to figure out what this left hand and right hand thing is all about too. They don't quite understand the significance of the two. Is the right hand better than the left hand? I think if you ask most people that, they would say, in this story, yeah, your right hand man is your chief guy, and your left hand man is, the other guy. So the copyists were wondering about that too, and somewhere along the line, one of the copyists must have thought, well, that's going to be clearer if I use this word for left and not that one. And so they started using this. It's really interesting. It's maddening, I will say, but it's interesting. And the reason I think it's interesting is because the questions that we have in trying to interpret these stories, they have. Even the folks whose job was just to copy it onto a fresh piece of sheepskin or something, they had the same questions we have. Like, what does this mean? How can I say this more clearly? How can I fix it? What is Mark saying here? And occasionally they would kind of add a little tweak to it to make it better. I like that. It puts us in the tradition of folks who ask questions and who scratch their head over what exactly Mark is communicating. So in my mind, what Mark is communicating is that James and John, whether their question is a legitimate question, their whole mentality is wrong. They're thinking that the reign of God is going to look like the empire. And remember, friends, that word repent means change the way you look at things. It metanoia, change your brain, change your mind, change your outlook. And they have not had a metanoia at this point. And once again, Jesus wants to give them a simple lesson. This is This is when Jesus slips into young church, right? And tries to make it as clear as possible. And he says, the Gentiles in verse 42, you know, among you, the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as rulers, lord it over them. Look at that. Look at that. That's what power looks like for Gentiles, for the empire, for people who don't belong to you and your identity, people who don't share your identity. This is how they look at power. But it's not so among you. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. So again, that paradoxical language, third time we've heard it, each time is related to Jesus disclosing that he's going to die. And this time, Jesus does something really, really interesting. Because in verse 45, he says, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many.
Jesus becomes the paradox.
Jesus is the paradox. That's right. He embodied. And you know, if the world hadn't fallen into the ravages of sin along the way, it wouldn't be a paradox. We all know that greatness is certain, but we don't all know that. And again, it's a huge challenge for those of us right now in the Christian church. We love thinking of Jesus as humble and all of that, but a lot of times we embrace that because we think it's going to give us a leg up on the rest of the world. And anyway, yes, Shirley, yeah.
When I read that scripture several times this week, for me, it reminds me of the very famous scripture or quote that lots of religions use. It's just saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's more or less the lesson there. You know, it was kind of interesting to me because that just jumped out. Well, he's saying, you know, you're not special. Everybody should be treated the same.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a great Christian value, and I do think it's the thing we share in common with other religions. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I'm seeing here.
Maybe
but,
not,
but
but
it,
I just,
but
you know, at least
yeah.
maybe my Bible, you know, I have a testament, but he says here, but it must not be so among you, or whatever among you wants to be great must become the servant, and if he wants to be first, he must be slave to all men. I thought, when I read that, I thought, well, that means no one's more important than anyone
Right,
else.
right, yeah, that's good. That's good. All right,
Although
any other?
lots of people are.
What's that?
Although lots of people are, we know, more important than other people, but
Oh,
the basic Christian.
let's transform our way of thinking. That no one is more important than anybody else. What if we started with that? What if we just take that and run with it, Shirley? What if we just start with that? Nobody is more important than anybody else. How does that change everything?
You know,
How does that change the person camping near your backyard because they don't have a,
that's right.
and damn it, it's your yard. I own this place, right? Right? We have feelings of entitlement because of whatever success we've achieved in our life, and they don't have it, and we almost feel justified that we can call the police and have them hauled up. Right? What if we started with Shirley? Wonderful admonition. Nobody's more special than anybody else. Would that seem like it would change our whole way of?
Utopia.
Yeah, or the reign of God, one
That's
or the
right.
other. Yeah. Yes.
Aren't we told to do that earlier when, and I can't tell you first, but the party the recommendation is that if you attend a party, don't go and take the first seat.
Right,
Take the further down seat and ask that the host will come over and elevate you.
right,
And it seems to be a kind of a same sort of an argument that here's James and John saying who's gonna be first among us.
right.
But we've already been told, don't be asking for the first things. Ask,
Right.
wait for the host to move you up.
Yeah, that's a great point. Cause that's the strategy Jesus gives, right? You go and take the lower seat, and if you're elevated in front of everybody. But if you take the upper seat and you don't belong there, then you can be humiliated in front of everybody. Yeah, and look, the thing about a paradox is that if you want to be great, become the servant. So the idea of being great, achieving excellence in itself is not the problem. The question is, how does one achieve excellence? What does excellence look like? And it's not a matter of stepping ahead of everybody else. And it's not a matter of elevating yourself to the highest seat. The way to achieve greatness is through service. And you really have to trust in a loving God who rewards us either in this life or the next, for this to be convincing, right? Because we see so many people clamoring their way to the top by being ruthless. And they may not be great in Jesus' eyes, but they sure do think they're great, and so do a lot of other people.
That's right.
It's a redefinition going on. Yes, Jim.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but I got real hung up on can you drink the cup and handle the baptism?
Right.
And I
Yeah.
was wondering, are you gonna talk about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I did talk about it a little bit in the presentation. I think, again, we have Mark writing 40 years after this is taking place and reflecting. This is just me. You don't have to believe this. I think it locates Mark in around this year 70 as part of a faithful Christian community, which practices baptism and the Lord's Supper often. We know that kicked in very early in the Christian tradition. You can tell it through the book of Acts, and you can tell it through Paul's letters. If the book of Acts is historically accurate, then even shortly after the resurrection, part of the church's life was around a shared meal, a Eucharistic meal. And even shortly after the resurrection, baptism was a practice they would use for anyone who became part of the Christian movement.
But if Jesus said this at this time,
Well,
Yeah.
if Jesus said it at this time, if is a really interesting clause there. My suggestion, and this is where it's Mark, and I pray for mercy when I'm saying this out loud. I don't think Jesus said that at this time. I think this is Mark presenting what Jesus said in the language of the earth. And the reason I say that is Jesus does not talk about his baptism the way that Paul talked about Jesus' baptism, or the way that the early church talked about Jesus' baptism. Jesus never mentions his baptism after the fact, except here. And it doesn't seem like he's looking back at chapter 1, when he went out and was baptized by John. He seems to be using it as a metaphor for the ordeal he's getting ready to go through. Baptism by fire, almost, we would say today, right?
that's kind of
That's how Paul talks about it. We are baptized into Jesus' death. And just as surely as we are baptized into his death, we are raised into new life. Paul saw the act of baptism as a death and resurrection. And that's the language that the church began using, reflecting from the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. When we drink the cup, this is the blood of Jesus. This points toward his death. And we eat from this bread and drink from this cup until he comes again. So this is part of our identity. I think as Mark is telling this story, Mark is using the language that they use in his Christian community to talk about the ordeal of Jesus' death and what it means. So I'm not saying that Mark is making things up, but Mark is not there. Mark's not there, and he doesn't have a recorder mic.
That's right.
He's not taking dictation. He's got stories that have been remembered, collected, passed down. Even if we believe the third-hand report that most of Mark's information came from Simon Peter. I don't know if I believe that, but that around the end of the 2nd century, that was how it was being described, that Simon Peter is the primary source for a lot of this information. I don't. But even if you believe that, this is Simon Peter 40 years later, after the church has gone through its own ordeal and has figured out what the baptism of Jesus, what it's like to be baptized with Jesus. They've gone through persecution. They've seen people they love put to death. They've been in prison. They've had to run away. 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, this story is being written for, as far as we can tell, the first time. And it had been orally transmitted, and these stories have been told and shared and passed down all that time. And somehow Mark gets it, not firsthand, or perhaps from Simon Peter, but Mark was not there. So at best, we have a second-hand witness to the story, not the event, right? And this is the story he has received. If you ever wonder about this, look at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke and see how Luke says he writes his gospel. I have studied all the stories. I've paid attention, and I've collected these stories, and I'm presenting it to you the best that I can. Luke is very, very open that this is not, he didn't sit down and God said, okay, chapter 1, write this, and he's taking dictation. That's not how inspiration works, at least according to the Bible. Yes.
So when Jesus praying in Gethsemane, let this cup pass from me, is it referring to, according to Mark, the communion cup of shedding of blood thing, or is it some sort of reference to something bad that the cup was,
Right.
was
Right.
used to fate?
My guess, and honestly, I'm just doing my best. My guess is this is the language of the early church to describe the ordeal of Jesus.
So using cup pass from me was not just like a fate, with different fate, it was the specific bloodline.
It sure seems like it. It sure seems like it. And look, that prayer of Jesus in the garden is one of the most honest, difficult passages in the gospel. Because Jesus is saying, if there's any way, let this cup pass. He's already told them that with God all things are possible, right? It shows Jesus in agony about what's getting ready to happen. He doesn't float into it knowing that it's all going to be all right. He dreads it. And, the teardrops, tears like sweat drops of blood, you know what? This is agony. And he's facing something that's going to be horrible. And he asks if there's any way that he doesn't have to. But the heroism of that prayer is, nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. And that's like the most honest prayer you're ever going to see, right? I don't really want to get beaten to death. I don't really want to sit here and suffocate and bleed out. Much less the mocking and the ridicule and the obscenity of it all right in front of the people I love. Jesus didn't want that, but he did want whatever God wanted. And so, yeah, I think there the cup is, maybe it was a first century colloquialism, you know, that would be, my sense is it's an early church colloquialism that refers to the suffering death. June, yeah.
In my research about the cup, I found two things that it's in the Jewish tradition. The cup signifies, you know, the sanctity of service to God. And so it's acknowledging the service that's going to happen. Or the other one that I found was that it meant to share in someone's faith when you drink from the cup. And so, like, every Seder meal starts with the cup. And
Right.
I kind of took this little passage and separated the cup and baptism. And I, again, put it to not so much the new church, but that the Jewish men are asking, you know, he's asking, can you drink of the cup? That's part of their tradition. The baptism, I kind of felt like probably was the baptism of fire type, you know, the what's to come.
Yeah.
And not. So I keep going back to the tradition of the men at the time.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's-
And right. And my only difference, I think, first of all, the early church tradition came directly out of the Jewish tradition, Second Temple Jewish tradition. The Last Supper was a Seder. So yeah, that's an inheritance for sure. John the Baptizer was a Jew baptizing Jews, right? So this was a thing. What the mystery of that is, where did baptism come from? And never are we told, and this is why we started this whole tradition. Perhaps it's traced back to the mikvah, you know, the cleansing ceremonies, but that was mostly washing your hands or your feet or something like that. It seemed somewhat different. However, it was, wherever it came from, it was a practice of Jews by the time Jesus was born. And John the Baptizer did it. And in none of the stories about John do any of the gospel writers say, you know why John started baptizing? You know how this started? They just kind of take it for granted. Baptism is what we do. So baptism and the Lord's Supper, which only laterly were identified as the two sacraments for the Protestant church. They came directly out of Jewish practice. So you're trying to locate the sense of these terms in the experience of these early first century Jewish men. And I'm trying to locate the sense of the term in the late first century Jewish Christian church. But knowing that the Jewish Christian church inherited these things from the Jewish tradition. That makes sense? Because I think for the Jewish Christian church, the death of Jesus became the defining feature of what the cup and baptism are. And that would not have been true for the people John was baptized. But Jesus hadn't been crucified at that point. So I think Mark is writing as a practicing early Christian. living in the power of those inheritances from the Jew. She's fine. She told me she had to leave,
Yeah.
go to a doctor's appointment. So anyway.
I think it makes
but-
a real difference though, how you read the text.
Probably does, yeah. And
It's like, which came
I'm
first,
fully,
the chicken
I'm
or the
fully on
egg?
the team, I'm fully on the team that, that pays a little more attention to where the writer is located in
Yeah.
telling the story. And listen, the reason I'm on that team, and I'm making a case for it, is you don't, from, in any of the gospel, in any of the synoptic gospel, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, Jesus' baptism is not something he talks about. It's not his teaching point. But it does here become something that Jesus says, which I'm going to argue is because for Mark, it has crucial meaning. And for Mark's community, to whom he writes, it has critical. You just don't see it a lot in Jesus' teaching. But you can tell by through the Apostle Paul that it was a huge issue for the early church. And not just baptism, but Jesus' baptism. That Jesus was baptized, Paul picks up on and describes his baptism as a death and resurrection. Not just the practice that we inherited from John the Baptist. You can say that John's approach to baptism and Paul are very different. For John, it's a sign of the repentance for the forgiveness of sin. A cleansing, as it were. For Paul, it's a death and resurrection. And it's a participation in the life of Christ. That's not, they're not oppositions by any means.
He loads it up.
Well, I mean, because he's a Christian. John the Baptist was not a Christian. He pointed toward the Christ. He was a forerunner, but he came before and he died before Jesus' death and resurrection. No sense in him, talking about it. It helps, I think, to be comfortable with the idea that a lot of these doctrines and a lot of these terms, they're evolving. They're inherited, they're given new meaning, they take on new meaning. They're in play, as it were. And we tend, I think we've all been trained to read the Bible statically, that it was more or less dictated, says what it says, always said what it said, and you just have to take it or leave it. And when you read the Bible closely, you start to realize that they're kicking the subject around a little bit. And this person kind of has this take and this person has that take. And it's not that it's contradictory, but it does show some sense of evolution of how these terms have taken on different meanings.
Are we still getting modern interpretation or readings or evidence of text that's being studied and changed now?
Yeah. But again, I'm just not a really good text scholar, as it were. I don't know. I do know that the big motherlode of all of that were the Dead Sea Scrolls. That changed everything. They had some scrolls there that had been sealed up in ceramic for millennia, or more than a millennium. And wow, that changed everything, because we then had access to scrolls that were evidently older than some of the ones we had access to. The oldest parchment that we had is, I think I remember this from my first year of seminary. So I could be off, but it's about this big. And it's a portion of John chapter 17, which is Jesus' prayer in John's Gospel. It's about that big. Or it's not until 100 years later, a document 100 years later that's full in total. We have bits and pieces that have been put together smartly and powerfully. That's why these copyists are such a big deal. Is, when we say manuscript, we're not talking about something Mark wrote in 70. We don't have that. We've got what the person who copied Mark copied, and the person that copied them copied, and the person that copied them copied, down several generations before you get to that little piece of earliest Mark we might have. So the story continued to be kept alive through copy, and then embodied in preaching, embodied in the church. We don't have Mark's manuscript. It honestly, if you ever get a chance to see the Dead Sea Scroll, do it, and just marvel at what we don't know and what we do know. They're both marvelous. I think.
I think that's one of the most important things for me to keep reminding myself of that we, that this isn't like reading something that somebody 20 years ago wrote a bio on.
Right.
And reading the scripture, it's interesting because before each chapter I get a synopsis on this, and it said that there was a great fire of Rome that wiped everything out. Nero was in charge. That happened before Mark wrote this, and the Christians were they felt that Nero was saying they were responsible a lot for it, which preceded that, what set things up, very normal things. But it said that it was Peter, he was taking what Peter has said and passed on to give to us.
Yeah, there's a history. There's a history behind all this. Now, that only bothers Christians from about the middle point of the 20th century later. Because around the middle of the 20th century, we started getting this fundamentalist approach to the Bible and became book bound. What did I read recently? There was like 13% of early Christians could read. They were being trained to fish, build houses, be slaves, more or less. Literacy was valued in the Jewish community, but only if you could. And, I don't know how terribly literate Jesus was. Literacy is not an either or thing, right? If you know the Bible, having heard it many times, then you could possibly read the Bible and not be able to pick up a novel by James Joyce and read it with any comprehension. It would just be different. It would just be different. My paternal grandfather, I can tell from the notes that he and my grandmother wrote in our family Bible about their family, they were hardly literate. They just misspelled the kids' names, all of that. But you ask him anything out of the Bible, he would open up and read it to you. He read that thing so many times. This was like what he knew. But it didn't transfer everywhere else. So think the Christian history. Think about how Christianity spread. Think about where it established itself in Europe and Northern Africa. Think about all these things and just ask yourself, how book-bound was it? How literate were these folks? This is why preaching was so important. You had someone who could read and read the story, would get up and read the story and tell you what it meant. That's their job. Because you probably didn't have a Bible at home that you could open up, and if you did, you probably couldn't read that. Kind of. What motivated and animated church was not that we had a book that gets it all right and we can pass it down for generations. It was that the Spirit who inspired this book is the same Spirit that's with us when we worship and preach and teach and fellowship together. And we are not, I always say this to my Jewish friends and sets them back. We're not a people of the book. We're a people of the Spirit. And the same Spirit that enlivened this book, inspired it, as it were, is the same Spirit working in you and hasn't retired. I think that makes me feel like, okay, if Mark is using the language that really works for him and his community to describe having Jesus say something to describe his forthcoming ordeal, why not? That makes sense. Bless him for doing that. Then the people who heard his story originally got it. That's how he captured what Jesus was facing. Anyway, look at me digging myself deeper and deeper into mendacity. Yes, ma'am.
In 30 seconds or less, how did the Spirit and Mark define the word ransom then?
Yeah, that is a fabulous question, and
30 seconds is all you have.
Yeah.
Took me a couple hours last night. But,
yeah,
it seems like from what you said today, then it can have Mark meaning, and it can have a
and my guess is that it has a Mark meaning or it has an early church meaning.
okay.
Only because, again, here and in Matthew's telling of this same story, the only time that word is ever used.
Is it the same definition in Greek in both texts?
In Mark and Matthew, it's the same word in both.
It's the same word.
Yeah, and there are a family of words that sort of seem somewhat connected to that, but in terms of that word itself, this is the only time. Even Paul doesn't use this particular word when describing the reconciling work of Christ.
So what meaning would you give it?
Well, I think it's closely related to the word redeem, at least in its original meaning. To redeem is those of us who ever saved green stamps probably have a better sense of what that word means than others. Something's held and you give them something to get it back. You redeem that. So a ransom, I think it means similar to what we think when we hear the word ransom. He gave his life for others to live. It's an exchange. Yeah. But it's not a common New Testament word. It springs out of nowhere, it seems like, here in Matthew, and then it's not really one that gets picked up and echoed. Not in Paul, not in any of the later letters of the New Testament, not in Revelation, and nowhere else in the Gospel. So I don't have much for you on that one. It's a curious term, but clear. I think the meaning of verse 45 is clear. Jesus is the paradigm. Okay. I feel like I've dug very deeply into things that are maybe more confusing than helpful.
More food for thought.
Let me read a quick quote from Adela Yarborough Collins. She's talking about Mark's community to whom Mark is writing. She said, those members of the audience are intimately familiar with Jewish scripture and probably could have perceived there are allusions to Isaiah here in this saying. According to the Septuagint version, that's the Hebrew Bible was translated into a Greek text 100 years before Jesus was born. It's called the Septuagint because there were allegedly 70 scholars that worked on it. So you'll see it in commentaries signified by LXX, the Roman numerals for 70. The Septuagint. It's very important. Most of the New Testament, right, most of the Gospels, when they quote the Old Testament, are quoting the Septuagint. They couldn't necessarily read Hebrew. Okay. According to the Septuagint version of Isaiah 53:11, the servant of the Lord is a just man who serves many well. So you have the word dikaio, from which we get our word deacon. You've got the word doulos. If you have ever heard of a doula, that's the woman who assists the mother giving birth, while the midwife assists the child. The doula is there for the mother. It's a servant, translated usually slave or servant in the Bible. And polos, which means many. So you've got the dikaion, the just person, and who's a servant of many. The following verse adds that his life was given over to death. He bore the sins of many. So Isaiah chapter 53 is one of those texts that we call the suffering servant text. And it's one of those texts we read during Advent sometime. That seems to introduce into Hebrew thinking that someone who is just, who is going to bear the sins of others on their behalf. The language of bearing sins casts this servant into the role of a scapegoat. And the Hebrew version describes him as an offering for sin as well as a scapegoat. But she says the image of ransom doesn't occur in this passage. It occurs elsewhere in the Jewish scripture. And some of the more informed members of Mark's audience might have interpreted this in light of those occurrences. So she's also struggling with, where did this term come from? There is an image of a suffering servant giving his life on behalf of others. This particular term is less common. So, okay, that didn't help at all. Sue Ann's coming in to just kind of see who's here.
We're laughing because there's a squirrel out.
There's a squirrel in front of us. Okay, the first thing we need to do is shut the door. He left? Oh, thank you. All right. I figured if we baptized him, we'd never see him. Confirming he wouldn't have to come back. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for everything,
Thank
Sue Ann.
you.
If you're there, you can turn this off. And